Hello and welcome to the first Insights panel. My name is Will Patch. I'll be moderating today. I'm the Enrollment Marketing Leader here at Niche. I'm really excited for this group of individuals. This is something that I hope a lot of you were on the Accept Group webinar yesterday. That was a lot of energy, a lot of great ideas. I'm hoping this can take that same amount of information, same energy, and bring it into what's actually going to be the actionable steps for schools that either are going test optional or considering. I know we have some high school counselors and independent counselors on the line here as well. I hope you can get a lot about the policies here as we go. We'll just go through. I ask everyone to give their name, title, their institution, the institutional policy, then how long that's in place and what's changed over time. We'll kick off here with Andrew.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. I'm Andy Palumbo, AVP for Enrollment Management at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Mass. We've been test optional since 2007. We're the first nationally ranked STEM institution to go test optional. And we, just a couple years ago, eliminated the use of test scores in our merit policy. So we're test blind for merit scholarships as well.
Hi everyone, Jay Murray. I'm the AVP for Enrollment Services at Western Connecticut State University. We're in Danbury, Connecticut. I believe our test optional policy was put in place shortly before my arrival, so I want to say it's 2011 or 2012. And only about 10% of our population is coming in without test scores. One of the challenges we have is test scores are still linked to placement for first year writing and math courses. We're currently reevaluating test scores for merit, so that will probably change for the 2021 cycle.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Petrie. I'm the Dean of Admissions at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. Lawrence has been test optional since 2006, and I arrived at Lawrence in 2012, so quite a few years there. Steve Syverson, the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at the time, really led the way on our test optional policy. And we are test optional for both admission and merit scholarships. So if a student wants us to use their test scores, we will use them for admission and scholarships. If they don't, then that's just one last factor that we have in consideration for both admission and merit.
Good morning, everyone. Rodney Morrison, Vice President for Enrollment Management at University of Delaware. I've been here 10 months, so don't quote me on everything. So please fact check as well. And we have been test optional since 2017 in state for Delawareans. And this year will be the first year that we're going to go test optional for everybody. So that's a little bit different in terms of a hybrid approach there for our test optional.
Great, thank you all. As we go here, if you have questions, please drop those in the question block. If they fit in neatly in the organic conversation, I'll ask those then. Otherwise, we'll take all questions at the end. Just also want to remind people, because we always get this question, the recording will be going out tomorrow morning. We'll send out email and you'll get access to all of that. All right, so the first question for everyone, how do you make sure that faculty, staff, and leadership really understand and support this policy? And then do you still receive any pushback?
Well, it was interesting. So at WCSU, the Faculty Senate actually voted and approved this. But I'm not sure anyone remembers that. And I had to explain it to the previous provost because, yes, it was approved, but you still have placement testing linked to test scores. So obviously the work wasn't done to inform everyone that things have to change. I've now seen COVID-19 and the pandemic shutdown of campus as an opportunity because we couldn't test anyone who needed to be tested for placement. So for those that had test scores, we were fine. But for those who would test optional, we normally would have given them administered a writing test or a math test for first year courses. So we couldn't. So we had conversations with the dean, all in arts and sciences, that, hey, we're going to have to go to auto place or blanket or initial course test them when they get in class in fall. Excuse me. And that's something that's going to have to continually be evaluated, but the precedent has now been set. And if it's successful going to the fall, we should be able to eliminate and really separate those and really become a truly test optional institution. So forth. But we constantly have conversations with people like, well, no, Johnny's scores aren't in our SIS because Johnny does not have to submit them. Well, why not? Because it's our policy, you know.
Yeah, I guess I would add at WPI, it's been 13 years or so since we went optional, and that was a really thoughtful 18 months or so working with faculty. We had, I believe, one faculty vote against, so almost unanimous. But I've been a part of going test optional at 3 other institutions, and I guess the advice I would give to folks is to lean into criticism, lean into difficult questions. I think what you'll find is there's tons of third-party data, Defining Promise, Steve Syverson, Bill Hiss, excellent research to help make the case on campus. But find your vocal critics, find out what their real concerns are from a data and research perspective, and then deliver it. And I think you start with that sort of maybe popular media, then you drill down to third-party research, and then you work on campus with institutional research with faculty to really drill down into your own numbers. And I think the positive news there is that sometimes your most vocal critics, certainly it's been my experience, they're some of the biggest supporters once they get their questions answered. And so I would lean into legitimate criticisms. You'll have folks who just say, oh, you're dumbing things down, you're watering things down. You can try to share the actual stats with those folks, but some people will just default to sort of a popular myth. But to the extent you can win people over with data, I would say lean into the criticisms.
I think that's good advice, Andrew. Because it's been so long here, we no longer need to continually have the conversation about being test optional. Steve did a lot of work here back a long time ago with a lot of the data, but our faculty, we're very fortunate. They come at their work with wanting to do what's right for students, and I think that that's the advice I would give to folks who are doing this now is as much as we can point to the data and show that how predictive the test is of a student's socioeconomic status. It is predictive of a student's socioeconomic status largely, and if we can point to that, I think faculty want to do what's right, and they want to support students and to give them access to education.
Yeah, University of Delaware was also a faculty senate decision in 2017 for the first cohort of Delawareans, and faculty were honed in on, again, what's the data, what's the retention data, and so in looking at the data from 2017, that cohort, as comparison to those who chose not to go test optional, the retention rates were not statistically different. I mean, literally, hundreds of percentage points difference. And so I think that, and they're interested in terms of retaining for first year, second year, third year. And I think even though the data showed there wasn't that, basically very little distance that first year, and then the second year we did in 2018 was a little bit more variance there. And then the third year we honed in on providing some more support and really looking at those students, and I think that made a little bit of a difference. But even with that said, there was a lot of debate literally just a few weeks ago in the discussion to go test optional for everybody, and I think the tipping point was given COVID and given the fact that a number of students don't have access to the tests this year. And so even I think College Board has come out and at least for the SAT, they've come out and said, listen, yeah, there's a number of students who may have been impacted, not able to test. And so they even have I guess I won't say recommended, but certainly have identified and said, yeah, they understand why many of us are going test optional. So yeah, and it's still a debate, and even with that, there were faculty on both sides of the aisle, and of course, it's unlike any other faculty in the other school. Everybody, I'm sure at all my other institute colleagues here, institutes, all faculty always agree on everything, right? So here they don't, and so there were debates on both sides, but at the end of the day, I think because of COVID, we were able to make the case to go to pilot for everybody for this year.
Great. We've just had a flood of questions come in. One I'll pull out here that fits nicely. Andrew, specifically, what data did you present to faculty, and what data points really help make that difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think there's really two camps right now with test optional. One is sort of the COVID lack of testing, which I think is sort of an anomaly. You know, I think most people that have been doing this work, that have been going test optional for years, have really looked at you know, some of the issues with the test, as Mary Beth pointed out. And so I think that, you know, it's important first for people to understand the why. So, you know, WPI, the why was we felt that test scores, first of all, weren't needed to make good admissions decisions. I don't think that's a particularly revolutionary comment for anyone in this panel or the, you know, 200 some odd people participating in this. Sometimes getting others on campus to understand that can be difficult. But, you know, we helped explain, you know, there are sort of severe issues of underrepresentation in the STEM world. And so to have a test that correlates problematically with family income, with sex, and with race and ethnicity is counterintuitive to our mission and to what we're trying to do. And so helping people understand the why, and then finding the resources that help support that. So I mentioned Defining Promise, which is an excellent study that looks at sort of the long-term impact on schools that have gone test optional. I think Rodney pointed out, you know, little to no variance in terms of retention, graduation rate. Those are the types of things that people want to look into. And so I'd definitely start with Defining Promise, but I would reach out to folks on this panel and other people you know who are test optional to find out what resources were helpful for them. I think I sort of talked about the scaffolding of sort of, you know, popular media first, help people understand the issues, the why, then sort of the third party data, and then trying to dig into your own data.
Mm-hmm. And so for us, for those not familiar with the state of Delaware, it's a fairly small state, less than 1 million people, and we're I would consider us an SAT state, meaning that more students are taking the SAT, and College Board's sort of assessment in terms of how many test takers there were in the state, the total state of Delaware last year was something around 10,000 students total, and of those 10,000, based on their assessment, that only about 30% were deemed college ready, so on their readiness chart. And given that we're the flagship school in the state, there's a lot of public pressure as well to admit as many Delawareans as possible. And so given the you know, the results of the test, and we noticed that there were students who just were not applying to the university because they either felt they couldn't get in, or that based on the SAT they weren't doing well enough, or for whatever, the variety of reasons, and that it was the faculty okayed a pilot to say, is this an impediment for students applying? And again, it boiled down to, well, can they do the work at the University of Delaware? But really, it was, you know, are we able to show that more students would apply from the state, and that it would take away some of that, and that they would still be able to retain and graduate. And so that was the kind of data we were able to show here.
Great. Have any of you, or you're aware of anyone who've had faculty actually take the SAT or ACT and then determine whether that tells them anything useful?
No.
I have taken as an adult. This was an exercise that we went through when I was at Butler University. And I found that my scores did not improve since the first time I took it when I was 17. So actually, they were quite a bit worse than the first time I took it when I was in high school. So so it was just part of an exercise of empathy, I think, and just trying to put ourselves in the student's shoes. And it was a good exercise for us.
Yeah, if you haven't had a chance to talk to folks through on the high school side, and those of you that are on the high school side, you know this, the anxieties around just the availability or lack thereof are causing a lot of concerns. And so for that reason, I mean, the amount of calls we were getting about what are you going to do? My kid can't take the test or retest or all those things. And there was a lot of concern, and there still is. And so I think just responding to what the public need, and I think for us was sort of stressing that to faculty, I think helped a little bit.
One other question here before we move on to the sort of scheduled questions. This is a great one, I think. Do you have any sort of onboarding or classes for new faculty, new staff, new board members to help bring them up to speed on why you're test optional and the benefits of that?
We do not. Although that is a wonderful idea as far as spreading the message. I struggle sometimes because initiatives like this, although I think the conversation needs to be had and it needs to be had more often, sometimes when things don't start in the faculty senate, they have a harder time gaining traction. It's almost like it needs to be their idea, and then we'll have a conversation. But if it's mine, it's what does he know?
Yeah, I guess I'll add, we don't have a formal sort of training process, but one of the things I think has been critical to our growth in our test optional policies and in eliminating the barriers that we stated in our why was assessing regularly. And so what we found when our faculty approved this, it was initially a pilot, and they wanted to replace test scores with something else. And so they came up with this idea of giving students an opportunity to share something, whether it's a project, whether it's an essay, something that speaks to the type of institutional values. We're a project-based education model. We're very collaborative for the type of institution that we are. So giving students the opportunity to sort of show their fit for our culture was important to the faculty. And I think, it's a pretty creative idea. Turns out after assessing that, 8 years down the road, that was a huge barrier to actually the students that we wanted to use this policy. What we found was we would talk to students who were first gen or who were, attending a CBO because, they needed the extra supports to go through the process. And we were meeting with them and telling them, hey, you should really not submit your test scores. Don't worry about it. We had a conversation. And then we'd see them submit, and hindsight's 2020, but we should have really looked at it and said, first of all, talk about a liberal arts type of assignment for STEM institutions. So there's a mismatch. But also, students who we're targeting very often, especially, students from lower SES families, are likely to have the least amount of time, the least amount of guidance, the least amount of awareness of how to tackle something that was really unique from all the other schools. And so that's one thing. We did away with that. We don't have any replacement. And what we saw was a huge increase in the number of first gen students, underrepresented students of color, students who we were really trying to broaden access to. So that was definitely a barrier. And the other piece we realized is that, for us, the next step was, almost a decade in, eliminating the test scores from merit scholarships for the exact same reason that we're eliminating them from admissions. And so that would be my pitch to anyone who's already test optional or who's thinking about it. For the same reasons that these are problematic to use for admissions, they're problematic to use for merit scholarships. And that's not, criticism, anyone who's doing that now. It's just an opportunity to consider that and see, is this an opportunity to look at that in your own campuses. It took us almost 10 years to really have that aha moment and do the work of unraveling that.
Okay, next question here. How are application review and admissions decisions affected by not having test scores in consideration? And then we've also had over a dozen questions asking about how merit scholarships are now determined without test scores.
Well, at WCSU, we didn't see it did not complicate the process at all for admissions decisions. It was actually, okay, the students that we're looking at SAT scores, we're going to do it this way. The students that don't submit, we're doing it this way, but we're acting like the SAT wasn't even there. So it more or less became a neutral factor in the admissions process, and it actually made things smoother because we found that we're a Common App school. We discovered that students who failed to click I'm applying test optional, but then didn't submit test scores, did intend to be test optional, just forgot to check the box. So there actually was some workflow improvements that were developed as part of that.
It's funny, I had a conversation last night with a good friend of mine who has been in the test prep business for a long time, and he's been getting the same questions in terms of, well, how in the world are schools going to determine, merit-based scholarships? And his response was I chuckled at it, and he said, I guess his standard response is, well, there's a lot of other data that colleges have other than a lot of data points. And so we do. I mean, we have, the 4 years of high school data and the courses and the rigor, and we have essays, and we have extracurricular activities. So there's a lot of data that we already have. And some school reports, not all school reports are created equal, but some are really good, and we can tell pretty quickly who the top students are. And so I wouldn't worry so much. I think we're all. It is an opportunity for us that did use test scores as part of the decision to rethink that a little bit. And I don't think there's a standard on how schools are going to do that. And I think that's okay. And I think that would be a good question, I think, to ask of any schools that students are looking at. But we do have a lot of data points, and so I'm not worried at all. And we will be giving out the money. So someone asked me the other day, well, are you not going to give out any money now? No, we're going to give out some money. So don't worry on that. That's
on that point that Rodney's hinting on there is, I remember working with a consulting firm years ago, and Jim Scannell said, when you think about the SATs, we've put a value on the score, meaning the student and society has it's not that the score means something, it's that a student who has a 1400 feels a certain way about it, and the school was then feeling a certain way about it to almost appease how the student felt about it. And when you remove that, you really do. You look at that transcript and realize there's a lot of information there that actually does have value and does have meaning aside from this 4-digit score or 3-digit score or 2.
And since you plugged my first boss's boss, Jim Scannell, he's one of the gurus of enrollment in the country, and he's since retired, but shout out to Jim Scannell.
Well, I agree with both of your points there. I think of it as our job. Like, it's our job to figure out, based on the information that we have, if a student is a good fit, if the student's ready for the challenges of our institutions. And there are other instances where we have an absence of a piece of data. We might have a school that doesn't give grades. We might have different grading systems in different countries, and there's always challenges to figure out. In an absence of one piece of data, now what are the other pieces that we can use to help figure this out? It's our jobs, not the students' jobs, to make it easy on us, right? And so we use other factors, right? We do interview students as much as we're able to. We look at the essays. We have numerical assessments behind the scenes, so we have assessment points for the challenge of the level of a curriculum the student took, the essay, the quality of the essay, and other factors that we're giving numerical assessments to that we can use over time to help our faculty understand these are also predictive assessment points to a student's ability to be successful at Morrison. And so that's been helpful over many years to have those pieces too.
Yeah, I guess I'll add, I get both those questions a lot from, peers who are at institutions who are considering one of or both of these things. And so again, I'd just say, reach out to anyone in this panel on social media, via email, reach out to other people, because, the more people you speak to, the more you understand and contextualize things for your own university. But in terms of admissions decisions, I think it's important for us, for our own sanity, but also for transparency for students and for the counselors that work with them, being really clear about how we use test scores and how we don't use test scores. I think that's difficult because every institution is different. So WPI, we're very explicit about saying the SAT, the ACT, this is not an academic credential. So anytime we talk about academics, test scores don't have anything to do with that. When we went optional, what that truly meant is you can send it. And so when I think about some of the schools that have gone test blind, they're saying we don't want to see that. That's not a part of our process. And I think that's great as well. For test optional, for us, we're going to view that as anything else that's optional that we haven't required that a student sends in. So they want to send us in something they did with FIRST robotics. Hey, that's great. That's awesome. They want to send us in, an activities resume. That's great. Really, this is about allowing the students to have a little bit more control. And if someone scored well in a test, and that's something that they value, and they've certainly put in the time to study or to prep, who are we to say no? So that's my perspective on test optional. That's how we use it. And from the merit side of things, I think some great points made already. We got this question at a NACAC panel a couple years ago, which caused us to do another one last year on this topic of eliminating test scores from merit. And the question was really simple. It was, but how on earth can you go test optional if you want to give merit scholarships? And it was great because most people don't even ask that question because you're so focused on going optional for admissions. But you need those scores for merit until you decide you don't. And so I think, as many of us work with, partners, financial aid optimization, when I talked with a former partner about what we wanted to do, they were like, you're crazy. Why would you want to do that? Test scores are so predictive for you, and you're trying to optimize net tuition revenue, right? And so these test scores strongly correlate with family wealth. So, you need to actually invest and say, we're not going to go after every single nickel and every single dime in this process, and we're going to reinforce the more open and accessible admissions practices we have with merit scholarships that match it. Because if we admit the students, but we're rewarding people for their family income or anything else that has a problematic correlation with these test scores, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot if it's really an institutional priority to broaden access.
We're just got so many great questions. I'll try and triage a few here. Do any of you use two different scholarship matrices? One for students who do submit test scores and one for those who do not?
Our system, we don't use a matrix system to begin with because there's so many factors. It's more of like it's more of a formula, although I hesitate to call it that, but it kind of is in that if a piece is missing, right? If there's no test score, if there's no GPA in some cases, if there's no assessment score for our individual points behind the scenes, then it compensates around that. So the other pieces fill in and become a bigger part of the calculation.
I think you almost have to have a different scale, right? If you're factoring in for some and not others. So we do, and we're actually in discussions right now. And every year we just to kind of in terms of our own internal monies and just to distinguish, because I think some of the questions may have hinted on, well, if you don't take the SAT or ACT, does that mean you're not going to be considered for national merit monies? Well, I think what we're all talking about is sort of our own internal monies that we give out for merit. So just to distinguish those two. And again, I think the goal of all of our institutions is, we want to try to give the money out to those students who have been very successful at their schools. And I mean, we all have sort of slightly different criteria, but obviously we want to reward students who've worked hard and have shown academic promise. And so yeah, we'll have certainly those who decide to turn in their test scores will have a matrix that will incorporate that, and those that do not will factor some things in a little bit differently. So
yeah, we use the same model for everyone, but to get there, we did sort of tier things, and so we used one model, but there were some assumptions. And so what I'd like to share with folks, when you use a model, the worst thing you could do is assume that a non-submitter is equivalent to a low score. And so I would say, if you're thinking about it in that way, please don't. I think one of the best things you could do is to really consider, if we really want to try to hold this person harmless, treat a non-submitter as being average. Whatever your value is for an average test score, along with GPA and any other considerations, I'd encourage you to think about it from that perspective, because otherwise, again, it's if you're really trying to increase access to a certain population, you're shooting yourself in the foot by doing something which you probably don't intend to do, but it's something that you should give some critical thought to how you're going to weight a non-submitter if you're trying to use the same score for submitters and non-submitters, and you're using test scores.
One question that came up several times, I think, is a valid concern for students. Will students who submit their test scores get an advantage in the admissions process? Not necessarily saying that those who don't submit are disadvantaged, but are those who submit, do they get any perks? Is there any advantage? Are they viewed more favorably?
No.
Becomes a neutral factor.
Good. I think that's something that we're going to run into a lot with students, though. That well, yeah, they're saying that it's not, but is it really? I think there's going to be that anxiety.
It's important to say that it's not going to be a negative when we're talking about our test optional policies. When we're doing our admission presentations and we're meeting with students, it's important that we just tell them that, because you're right, Will. They may assume that. Oftentimes they do.
Well, and we know that there's students who maybe didn't perform as well over the course of their 4 years of high school, who just may be strong test takers. And I've talked to a couple of parents who said, please, accept the test, because my son or daughter is really good. And we said, we will, don't worry. So I mean, it's we're looking at both sides of the issue here, and we know we're going to get that question 1,000 times, which is better. There's no difference, I think, is what we're all trying to communicate here.
So without test scores, are you giving any additional critical eye to GPAs and the specific classes than you were before?
I would hope we all had a critical eye on GPAs before this, and I think my colleagues will all agree that that
was a trick question.
Yeah. You know, and again, I guess, and that's my own philosophy, that I think how you've done over the course of 4 years of high school tend to be more indicative of your performance than a one-day, 3.5 hour test. But so I guess part of that question also, well, are you going to be asking for additional stuff? And so at least at University of Delaware, we do ask, if a student does choose test optional, that we have a couple additional questions, essay questions that we ask them. But that's it. So it's not anything different in how we're going to evaluate sort of their high school transcript, but we're trying to get some other additional potential information we couldn't get from either the Common App or Coalition App. So.
And that's the challenge with that question. On the flip side is there's almost a perception out there, primarily from the public, but then it becomes driven in the institution and reinforces that we're only looking at test scores.
Yeah.
You know, so that's why that question comes, are you scrutinizing? No, we always were scrutinizing it. Now we're just not looking at the test scores anymore. But the assumption was we were only looking at the test scores and not looking at the transcripts, which is not true. That's the myth.
Yeah, I think that is a misconception from families too, that they think, oh, you only look at my cumulative GPA, they aren't looking at specific classes. I think offices always have.
Yeah. And think about the comment I made before about the value. You don't get a question about the transcript from the student with the 1400 because they assume they're great because they have a 1400. You get the question about, you're not looking at the transcript from the student with a lower SAT because the assumption was you weren't looking at the transcript. So it's from opposite ends of the spectrum. But when you're test optional, you are looking at the transcript, but we always were.
Yeah, so how do you message this policy to students, to families, to counselors? And then do you use the policy as part of your communication flows and marketing and outreach?
Yeah, I guess I'll start transparently. You should be extremely transparent about what this means for your institution, because there is a lot of cynicism out there. There are a lot of questions. And I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges for any schools that are going optional temporarily right now, is to really think through, how do you message this out to people? Because a lot of the questions that are out there that we're seeing are, if people are only doing this for a year, are they going to invest in the training, invest in the process changes? And I think most will. And so I think that, with testing, unfortunately, we fall victim to these public misconceptions and myths, which often are propped up by expensive marketing campaigns. And, just this week we had, a College Board associated individual sharing an op-ed, perspective on AP testing. But I mean, like, there's a $1 billion industry in supporting this and in supporting some of these public misconceptions. And so the only way we're going to get around those is by being really transparent and clear about how we use tests, how we don't use tests. And it's difficult for students and counselors to keep all of our institutions apart from one another and to understand it. And so I think that the more we can provide that information in accessible ways to families, the easier it is for them and for the counselors that are working with them.
And I found that the biggest partners in that communication are the school counselors. I find that the school counselors are very appreciative when they hear that's your test optional, how you're applying it, what you're doing, what a student needs to do, because they're going to be the champions for in helping us get that message out to our primary constituents.
Yeah, we've got several other questions that are related to this. What additional questions then are you asking as part of this process to help craft your ComFlows and communicate these strategies. Are there anything that you've done to help make sure that this is communicated effectively?
I'll start with, I think we've recently identified at Lawrence that an opportunity for growth for us is how we describe our test optional policy on our we, perhaps wrongly, never intended the website to be where we put all of our policies and all the information, right? We used it more of a way to try to get students in the door and engage with us, and then once we start talking with them, we'll tell them a lot of the more of the behind the scenes, right? How we review applications and all of that, and this environment where we are not getting to see students face to face has illuminated for us that we need to put a lot more information on our website, and we probably should have done that before now. Because a lot of students are using the website to dig into that without asking us, right? Without engaging with us. And so, I think we're going to be assessing, we have our test optional information on the website. It just doesn't go very deep. And I think we can be more explicit to help counselors and CBO coaches to help our partners and parents and the students themselves understand what it means that it's not going to hurt them in the admission and scholarship consideration, that they have this choice, to understand what our middle 50% generally is in test scores, to understand whether, as they are trying to decide whether they should submit it or not, what's the information that they need to make that decision.
Okay, we'll have our last question here, and then I'll jump into some more of the submitted questions. I know we're running a little long here. So if an institution is still weighing the move to going test optional, what advice would you give them, and what considerations do they need to make? Just one point for each of you there.
Do it now. You don't want to be the last. Joking aside, though, consider scholarships. If you're an institution that provides scholarships, consider the impact that test scores have on scholarships.
And I would say consider access. Consider that you are going to be opening up your institution to a host of students that perhaps you did not even consider, and students who didn't even consider you, both ways by going test optional, and think of it as a long-term enrollment strategy.
Yeah, I agree with Jay. It's about access, and I was on a call with College Board CEO, and again, they were acknowledging that they assumed that many schools were going to go test optional. For those that are athletes out there, the NCAA has said, look, yeah, we understand that schools are likely to go test optional. So if you're Division I or Division II player, they're not going to factor that into the decision making this year in terms of their eligibility requirements. So are you at a competitive disadvantage if you're not test optional now, at least for athletes? But I think to me, it just, again, goes back to access, and are we providing access to students we may not have been able to see otherwise? And I think I'll end on this. I know you asked for one point, but access is one thing, but we have to make sure that we're supporting students so that we retain them and they graduate. So for us, our faculty senate has said you have to, we provide regular updates on how we're doing in terms of retaining all students, but they specifically want to know what are the differences between those who are test optional and those who are not.
Rodney said it well. What this does is it opens up doors for students. It opens up doors to first generation students, low income students, students of color, and our institutions need to be ready to support them over time. So that means it means a lot of things. It means taking a look at the makeup of our faculty, right? It means taking a look at our administration. Do we have administration to support student success, to support students of color and first generation students? We might need to look, for us, it's meant at Lawrence, it's meant implementing a bridge program. It's meant implementing some assessments so that we can understand as students are coming in where we might need to plug them in for additional help to get them the resources that they should have had all along, but they haven't, right? And then my second thing is, if you are considering this now, and I'm going to answer this for me, not as a representative of Lawrence as much, but if you're considering this now, I would encourage folks out there to be bold and ask a bigger question. Maybe test optional is a great start. It's a great place to be. But the bigger question is, if all of this is true, that what we know about the test, and if we don't need it, if we actually don't need it for consideration, maybe test optional is not far enough. And maybe that because you're asking this question and because we're in a moment of great change in our country right now, maybe this is the time to ask your faculty, do we need it at all? And then take the next step and say, what else in our admission and financial aid and scholarship processes, what else is a barrier that might be stopping low-income students, students of color, first-generation students from getting here and then being successful here, right? So go bold, be bold.
Starting the revolution, Mary Beth.
And that does
Well
get
said.
to that gets to one of the questions that was asked is, since we know the tests are so problematic, why are schools going optional instead of just test blind?
I can share the flip side of that. I think as many of the schools who have gone test blind, which I completely applaud. So I agree with Mary Beth. I think it's an opportunity for us to really consider some of these bold things. But I think what a lot of those schools are going to deal with is the person who said, yeah, but I spent a ton of time and money preparing for these tests. And you might hear that certainly from some of the more affluent coach students, but you may hear that from some of the very students who you're trying to broaden access for, who say, it's an opportunity cost. I could have been doing other things with my time, but so many of my schools told me this was really important for me to focus on. And I think that until we reach that tipping point within the industry where more students aren't taking the test than are, I think you're going to run up against this difficulty. And I've heard it from peers in school counseling and independent counseling who they struggle with it too. You've got a student who has a list of selective schools that require testing and a list of selective schools that don't require it. And there's always that fear that you're missing out on something, right? And so I think that, personally, I would advocate, let's get rid of standardized test scores across the board. Admissions, merit, we don't need them. We don't need them. But within the context of this environment, I think that for us as an institution, we're trying to support students in the moment in time in which we're operating in, and that to us means allowing students to make the choice for themselves, but being really transparent about how test scores will be used and how they won't be used.
Yeah, another one, with so many subjective data points being used now, and trying to provide a more holistic view, do you have set institutional rubrics for admissions so that all counselors are using the same process to review applications? And as someone who used to build those rubrics, I hope the answer is always yes, but I'll leave it up to you.
Yes, and this is what I think probably for all of us made the pivot to working remotely so easy. Is we built these rubrics, we built them into our CRM, we got rid of paper, so it really facilitated this environment, but it also facilitates the test optional environment, because you're all those things you need to do, you're doing on a daily basis. Anything, you just omitting one data point, which is the test scores.
Yeah, I would say we do use rubrics. I think what's more important than even the rubrics is how you calibrate during an admission cycle. And so one of the things we sort of flipped in our process was, we're not a committee-based evaluation school, but we sat in on a presentation or two from folks who are doing that. We took away some interesting things. One of the things we do is we make sure that we're having our committees early in the process. So the first week we have a committee, so people can get a feel for how other people are rating
Get on
students.
the same page, yeah.
Yeah, and that's been a huge help, especially for newer readers or for outside readers, to be able to say, "Oh man, I was really harsh," or "Oh, I was a little soft." Gives people that gut check. But I think most of us probably have checks and balances where we have first reader, second reader. And so I think that as long as you're being thoughtful about having a rubric, but also making sure that there's enough flexibility there that you're allowed to do a holistic review where you're considering the context of each applicant. And so I think that's where giving a little bit more flexibility than maybe the rigidity of a standard rubric, but having those opportunities for people to really get a sense of where everyone is at in a given year.
And then there's a chance to check in throughout the year. Because of our CRMs, we have an opportunity to run some reports by reader, right? And say, okay, well, this counselor seems to be giving everybody the top end score. Do we need to dig a little bit deeper and maybe and go back and see, does this match, and maybe recalibrate a little bit too. So we have some opportunities to check in throughout the year, run some reports, and see if we're running in the right place.
Yeah, it really gives you a chance to figure out who's actually reading the essays.
There you go. And then it's probably just my school, but when someone doesn't get admitted, they all seem to make their way to the president's office, and the president always sends them to me. So I go in and check all of those decisions as well. So that's always fun. So yeah, we've got, I think the point is, yes, calibration, checks and balances, and I think we all feel good about sort of our processes.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes left here, and I want to respect everyone's times and other commitments here. I'll just ask one more here. I'm sorry if your question didn't get asked. We're nearing 100 questions. There's just this would have to be several hours long to get to everything here. I really appreciate everything. There will be a recording of this going out tomorrow morning in an email. Last question here is one that I've seen before. If a student indicates that they do not want their test scores to be considered, they want to submit without scores, but then either their scores are on their transcript, or they had already submitted it, or they forgot, or somehow you still received those. What do you do? Do you delete those scores? Do you hide them? How do you make sure that they're not considered then for admissions or scholarships?
They're hidden for us. They get a little, like, I think it's asterisks or X's, or maybe I think now where they just don't show up at all when in the reader application when we're reading the app.
Yeah, we've gone even further because sometimes a student will submit scores, but they want to go test optional. So we'll keep them in our CRM because we're the only ones that see that. But in our SAS, it will go blank so that no one else on the institution has access.
I'll add too, so we have allowed students to change their mind about their decision to be test optional as long as it's before we've reviewed their application or sent out their admission decision. I'll say it's before that decision is finalized. They can change their mind and let us know by pretty easily clicking. They have a checklist when they log into their student portal to see what they're missing. They can click on it and submit a form that says, I no longer want you to consider my test scores. And we also allow self-reporting of test scores at Lawrence too. So students can self-report, and then once they matriculate, then we ask them to send us their official scores, but they can self-report in the meantime. They can use that same form to self-report if they choose.
Yeah, it's a great point. We allow self-reporting It's hidden from anyone who reviews applications, so you won't be able to get at that data. But one other thing we haven't really talked about is on the back end. One of the things that's helpful, especially if you're doing a pilot program, you need to really get a proof point. Get everyone's test scores. You don't need it at the time of admission, but afterward, get those test scores over the summer when you're requesting the final high school transcript. That's how you're going to be able to prove that your submitters, your non-submitters are performing relatively even or above potentially where their test score would have predicted for your university. So I would say that's something you're not always thinking about necessarily, but I would build that into the process. And then I also think it's a best practice that's the figure you report out to any of these ranking firms, all the test scores from the class, whether or not students chose to submit or not submit.
Great, and we're at time. I'm going to cut us off, unfortunately. Thank you for everyone attending, for all the great questions. You'll get an email tomorrow morning with the recording and then some additional information there as well. Quick survey just so I can know how to improve these panels in the future. Also, I just want to thank all of our panelists. You've all been fantastic. I really appreciate the time here this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And good luck to
I hope
everybody.
everyone has. Yes.
Thank
Yep.
you.
I hope everyone has a safe and healthy fall now.
All right. Take care.